My name is Bo Lee. I'm going to talk a little bit about how, not you, but ADP's journey to get API ready for consumption. And my name is Bo. So let's talk a little bit about ADP. Hopefully you know the company. If you receive, maybe your paycheck has the ADP stamp on there. We are a 70 years old company, and we like to think we are a technology company. But where we started was a service company, and over the years we built technology for our service people, and then we start selling our technology to our clients, and now we are a technology company. We have solutions all over the world, and when we talk about solution, we cross different domains, HR, payroll, and all that. Very complicated systems and very comprehensive solutions. And about 3 years ago, as part of the journey to the API economy, we created this new platform called ADP Marketplace. And the concept is awesome. We're going to provide our APIs so developers can use to integrate with our system, and they can build their solutions and then sell on our e-commerce store called ADP Marketplace. So talking about API economy, we have a success use case of how you can make money out of API. And where I come from is I am the API product manager that, getting the APIs to the store and getting the developers to use our API. That's where I come from. And to date, on our store, we have about over 300 connected applications using our API. And in our pipeline, we have over 800 vendors or companies waiting or in the middle of integrating using our API. Right now, we have over hundreds of API. It depends on how you count a API live in production across multiple systems. So I think we're doing pretty well. And part of my job to get the API ready is talk to, one side is about the builders on the API. And getting the builders to understand how do they get their API ready for consumption is very different than talking to your builders about how to build API. So my colleague Boris has been talking about how to get the builders to build API. But a lot of times I heard, at least from my company, the builder said, oh, I have an API. Maybe we can just throw it to a marketplace, have some people using it. And after a few months, they would say, how come nobody pays attention or knows about my API? So over the years, we have started giving them prescriptions or checklists of what you need to do. For example, most important thing is documentation. And when developers think about documentations, they think about all those great tools, right? Swagger this and OpenAI API, that's great. But something that is very different is there is a difference between API specification and product documentation. API specification is a contract that the API developer will use to develop their API, and they said, you want documentation? There is your documentation. Just take the specification. When I look at my documentation and give it to the consumer, they will say, oh, your specification says this, but you didn't deliver that. Your specification says this, but actually you did a little bit extra. So there is a big difference between the API specifications that your architect prescribed to you for build, and then what I call product documentation, which will give more color about what your API actually do instead of what it's supposed to do. And also, how a little bit about the use case of what problem does your API solve? So when people looking for those kind of information, they can find it. The second part of our training the builders to build API is also start giving them this kind of question. How do you secure your API? How do you secure your data? How do you control your data set? And also, what is your performance constraint? How big is your payload size? In ADP, we are a enterprise-wide company, so we do not just have a developer, expose their API, and we build all this layer in the middle to route the API service request, and we have, the gateway to control all these policies and, a syndication and all that. So I have learned over the years that in order to support a developer to expose their API into my platform, I have to let them know before they start building what are the limitations or constraints they have to work with. For example, my gateway has a timeout policy that people do not understand. So from their perspective, they said, okay, my API normally takes a few seconds to respond. But if my gateway time off at 1 second or 2 seconds, they don't even know their consumer got a different response than what they see in their application. The other thing is about the payload size, right? From a gateway perspective, we do not want to, we have a limitation on payload size. And without knowing that constraint, our developer, provide big payload. And then when we, expose and when they are used, now their API, getting all these errors and they don't understand. And then they get very frustrated about, why you didn't tell me earlier. So I have learned that as a product person, in order for me to really work with my vendors or API providers, I have to give them more information about my platform, about the constraints they need to use, and also what's the flavor of the usage. Once they start build the API, now they put it into the marketplace, and they are thinking about, okay, a lot of people are going to use it, and we're going to make a lot of money out of it because this data is very, very important. So I do agree at some times, but not all the cases. So as a product person, I do start asking my developers or the API builders about the value proposition of their API use case. Not all APIs are the same, and not all API are building for the same purpose. So for example, we have some of the use case that we build API is for competition, because our competitors have the API, and now we also have to have similar API. In those use cases, putting a dollar amount or charging additional fee for the API may not be, the right idea. But in other cases, we do want to make sure we don't leave money out of the table, so we start charging for our API. And when we consider putting a price for API, there's a few things that I learned over the years that have to be considered. One is the value. And how do you deliver this value? Is that by each transaction, or is that because the data within the payload? Where is the value, and how do you translate this value into the pricing strategy? The second one is about the operation cost. So operation cost has two parts. One is our platform cost, right? So if we learned in a hard way that we have one of the developer making over 10% our daily API volume cost for whatever good reason, and we're giving this developer for free. So we learned, let's think about the cost to our infrastructure and building the API pricing based on that, cost. Do we want to have the developer eat some of the cost, or we want to eat the cost ourselves? But without really considering that before you release the API, you're building a lot of holes for yourself. The second part of the cost is operational, the human side. So ADP, because we provide enterprise solutions, our APIs are super complicated. And a lot of times, as much documentation as we can provide to the developers, they still need human interventions to introduce them about the APIs, about the application, about the data model. So all this takes professional service like people to do. And when we roll out API program, you really have to consider all those operation costs about how do you service, how do you support from a human perspective and from a system perspective, and build that into, just make sure you consider them when you build your pricing. So from our perspective, we have two levels of pricing. One is a implementation cost that we offer. The other is transactional based. Every month, what is the price? And also business terms. That's what I said, earlier about, how many calls can you make as a developer? Maybe you can charge them in the tier based on call volume or based on usage. Now we have, the product ready. We have the price ready. We're almost ready to go to market. So a few years ago, we just threw them over the market. And what we have experienced is all this chaos within our own organization, because we have marketing did all this awesome job about our API, but our sales reps are not ready to talk about the API. So they were sort of like surprised by our customer when the client's asking them. And when the client asking them, the client may not be a developer, maybe a decision maker in a business asking, by the IT people to say, hey, if you want to evaluate this solution, make sure you ask them if they have APIs. So the business person, our buyers will ask, do you have APIs? And our sales reps are not trained about what is API, what do they do, how are they different between, the API, how are they different than a normal application? They don't even know how to talk about this, and they heard we have APIs, so they said, yeah, we do have APIs. But when, the next set of questions coming in about, what data do you provide, what's this, what's that, they cannot answer, and it delays their process. So we have learned that as part of API rollout program, we need to get our sales, marketing, service people trained. Otherwise, this whole API economy does not flow. I will give you an example about service organization. So when we roll out our API, we assume our API works perfectly. And then very soon, we got a first call from our clients about some API didn't work. And our service reps are not aware how to deal with the APIs. They know how to deal with applications, user applications. They know exactly how to replicate a problem using the application. But when somebody said, oh, I got a 404 on my API, they do not even know where to look for, how to replicate, who to talk to. So without getting them ready, it really impacts our customer experience, our NPS score, and also our service level agreement. So we have to quickly backtrack and build all this back into the organization and process. Make sure our service reps are trained, at least have some skill set about talking about API, replicate a problem, understand when a problem comes in, what data do they have to capture in order to pass that issue downstream to maybe a developer's hand. The other, and talking about issue handling, in addition to just train your service rep on how to replicate the issue, and when they cannot solve the issue on the spot, what information they need to capture in order to pass you to the next tier service, we also have to make sure we start logging in all our API platform component for all those traces. Because once we get a first ticket in, now we have all these development shops standing by, and nobody have the right logs in their hand in order to troubleshoot where the problem is. So quickly we have learned that, and we start asking people to log. And talking about logging, you probably also want to start standardize your logging mechanism so they can, all the different logs can tie together to give you that entire picture. And now we have the logs, we have the people, we have the issue, and now we have to really learn how to deal with the real API problem. And a lot of problem we have learned is exception handling. Throw a 404 is not enough. In addition, the payload message, now we have added more information about where is the exception, and also a little bit of, is this message user-friendly for the developer to build and surface on their application front end. So really thinking about how do you handle your API exception is very important for your end user. The other thing is treating API as a product. And when we roll out a product, there is a organization readiness component. I talked about getting all this organization ready. It's important to get them ready for the first time when you roll out API, but it's also very important to get them ready in every step of the life cycle. For example, when the new API comes, what do they need to know about talking about the new API feature, function, usage? But when we have improvement or enhancement of the existing API, we also have to prepare the organization, especially when there are already consumers consuming those API. Now we're releasing maybe not the second version, but enhancement to the existing version. We learned that we have to identify who are our consumers, make sure we reach out to them to say, here, there's more things coming for you, and you may want to take advantage of that. So communication is the key to really get manage all life cycle of your API. And now I have my internal organization and also API builder. I felt, okay, I'm ready to release my API. Let's see the consumer side. And over the years, in ADP, as part of the API program, we also start learning there are different consumers for our API. And they have different needs. And you cannot treat them the same. So we have internal and external developers. Internal developers, they may just reach out to the next developer indoor, and they can just have a coffee conversation, and instead of a very intensive documentation. But for external developer, there's more documentation needed in order to communicate. Within ADP, we also have two different type of consumer. One I called our clients. So our clients, they can have their developer using our API just to build some system for their own use. And also we have vendor consumers. Those are third-party company trying to build a solution and sell to our customers or their clients. For those vendors, we have different process, business terms, and also organization cater to them. So understand you have different consumers, have different need in terms of communication, documentation, support, business terms, legal. It's very important just to get all this ready. And also talking about documentation, I want to emphasize a little bit lesson learned that I know a lot of people have been telling me that, yes, we documented in Swagger. Here's your documentation. But if you think about the journey of discovering an API, assessing an API, and then determine this API meets somebody's need and really using it, in that journey, a lot of different people persona are involved. For example, the first part of identify API meets somebody's need, maybe a business person. The person may not care about your URI, your payload, your response time, all that. The API, the person may really just want to find out what data does this API provide. What data can it, can you use to read, write, or update? So having that level of conversation, documentation or information ready for those business people is very different than the technologist who after this business person decide, okay, we can use this API, let's work with ADP to build a connector. The second person coming in, a product person, may will start really define the MVP or what's their roadmap. And then the third person is the developer, really thinking about how to work with the API. So over the years, we have learned that we have to have the content for all these different persona. And each one is looking for a little bit of a different thing. And having a get started guide is very good for a developer, but maybe it's worthwhile to have a get started guide for a business person too. Last one, I don't want to say too much because the previous presenter, Matt, said a lot about the importance of having a community. Personally, we're just starting with our community, and I would like to build more. But I would love to hear from Matt about how do you build a community, because personally, in ADP, we do not have enough power to really do everything ourselves, and I'm looking for a community to do a lot of contributions. That's it. Thank you, everyone.